Imagine being laughed at, mocked, and dismissed by everyone around you, only to turn the tables in the most jaw-dropping way possible. In this story, an old black man walks into an elite auction house, ignored by the wealthy crowd and ridiculed by the auctioneer. But what happens next will leave you speechless. With a single, unexpected move, he buys the most expensive item in the room, in cash. How? Why? And what does this shocking twist reveal about power, perception, and the world we live in? Stay tuned. This is a story you won't believe until you see it. The auction house buzzed with excitement, the air thick with the murmurs of eager bidders, all hoping to claim the night's prize. The vast room gleamed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers, reflecting the polished marble floors and the gleaming frames of priceless art. Samuel, an elderly black man, sat quietly at the back, his eyes scanning the room with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy around him. He wore a simple coat, the fabric frayed at the edges, his shoes well worn from years of use. He appeared out of place, like a shadow in a room full of bright lights. Yet, there was a certain dignity about him that set him apart from the crowd of wealthy patrons whose designer suits and diamond watches glittered in the opulent surroundings. At the front of the room, the auctioneer Davis stood poised behind the podium, his voice booming over the crowd, smooth and practiced. His sharp suit, slicked back hair, and condescending grin made it clear that he believed he was the most important person in the room. With each item that passed across the block, he commanded attention, making jokes, offering flashy commentary, his words dripping with superiority. The crowd laughed along, feeding into his energy, but Samuel remained a still figure in the corner, observing, absorbing, the quiet in his gaze betraying a hidden knowledge that only he truly understood. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, the most coveted item of the evening would be revealed, a priceless painting by a legendary artist known to fetch millions at auction. As Davis announced its arrival, the room fell into a hush. Eyes widened in anticipation, hands tightened around paddles, and the air thickened with the scent of competition. Samuel, too, watched closely, his expression unchanged, his hands resting calmly on his lap. He knew the painting well, perhaps better than anyone else in the room. He had seen it years ago, a memory now resurfacing, stirring a quiet connection deep within him. The bidding began, with Davis adding his flair, describing the painting's history, its importance in the art world. "This is not just a painting," he said, grinning as if he were revealing a secret. "This is a piece of history, a legacy, a treasure only fit for the finest collectors." The crowd nodded in agreement, some exchanging knowing glances, others whispering about how much they were willing to spend. As the numbers began to rise, so did the energy in the room, the tension thickening with each offer. And then, from the back of the room, Samuel raised his paddle. The auctioneer's eyes flicked toward him, a slight frown forming as he registered the gesture. It was a brief movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough to halt the auction momentarily. The crowd's attention shifted toward Samuel, some faces contorting with confusion. The old man. What was he doing here, they wondered. His clothing was modest, his face unassuming, yet his hand raised with a quiet certainty. A chuckle rippled through the room, quickly turning into a low, almost dismissive murmur. Davis, with his usual confidence, raised an eyebrow and smirked, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Well, well, it seems we have an eager new bidder," he said with a scoff. "I must say, sir, this is a rather exclusive event. I'm afraid this might not be your scene." The crowd chuckled, some shaking their heads in amusement. The auctioneer's tone was mocking, a thin veil of disdain slipping through. "Perhaps you're not familiar with the world of high-end art, or maybe this is just a little hobby of yours," he continued, the words dripping with condescension. Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply lowered his paddle, his expression as neutral as ever, unfazed by the laughter surrounding him. In that moment, it was as if the noise of the auction house didn't even touch him. His silence seemed to make the crowd uneasy, as if they couldn't quite place him. The auctioneer, however, was growing more comfortable in his mockery. It was easy to belittle someone who didn't seem to belong, to push them aside as insignificant. And so he did, focusing his attention back on the bidding war, moving on as if nothing had happened. But Samuel, though quiet and unassuming, was far from invisible. His gaze remained fixed on the painting, his mind racing, not with desperation or desire, but with something deeper, a long-held knowledge that tied him to this moment, to this very piece of art. As the bidding continued, Davis's voice grew louder, faster, as he tried to escalate the price, feeding off the crowd's eagerness. But all the while, Samuel sat there, his eyes never wavering, his thoughts never straying far from the history of the piece before him. What the others saw as just a painting, he saw as something much more, a link to a past that many had forgotten. And as the price continued to climb, so did the tension in the room. Everyone knew the stakes. Only a handful of people could truly afford it. And yet there was Samuel, calm, quiet, almost as if he were waiting for something, for the right moment to strike. The crowd's mockery had become a distant hum, nothing more than background noise to him. His mind was far from the surface-level judgments. For Samuel, this was not about status or money. This was about something far more personal. The auction was about to reach its peak, and Samuel was not about to let the moment slip away. The painting's price had already surpassed $500,000, and the room's energy was now crackling with a mixture of excitement and competition. Davis's eyes gleamed with greed, his voice growing more frantic as he pushed the bidders to reach higher and higher. He knew that this was the moment where the big players would reveal themselves, and with every bid, his own confidence grew, his smug smile never wavering. The bidders around him were on edge, their paddles poised, eager for the next opportunity to make their move. Yet there, in the back of the room, was Samuel, still seated, still calm. The auctioneer's eyes flicked back to Samuel, briefly considering him as the price surged. With each new bid, the tension tightened, the stakes rising. But Samuel's presence seemed to make everyone uneasy, like a still rock in a fast-moving river. The mocking whispers had quieted, replaced by uneasy glances. They didn't know who he was, but there was something about him that demanded a second look. Was he truly just another forgotten old man? Or was there more to him than his clothes and demeanor suggested? The crowd couldn't decide, and that uncertainty only deepened the mystery around him. A moment of silence passed, a brief lull in the heated bidding as a new number was called out, and Samuel's paddle rose once again. It was a subtle movement, hardly more than a flutter of his hand, but it was enough to stop Davis mid-sentence. He faltered, his smile slipping for just a second as his eyes locked onto Samuel, then quickly darted away. The room was silent now. There was no chuckling, no murmurs, just the harsh echo of Davis's voice trying to regain its former command. "A bid from our distinguished gentleman in the back," Davis said, his tone laced with a forced cheerfulness, though his words were slightly clipped. He was unsure, but he covered it well. The room's gaze turned toward Samuel once again, and this time the mocking smiles turned into confused frowns. There was no one here who didn't know how the game worked, how much it cost to play, but here was Samuel raising his paddle again, offering only a modest sum. It wasn't enough to truly compete, but it was enough to send a ripple through the room. A few people exchanged glances and the whispering resumed, this time with more suspicion than amusement. Was he testing the waters? Did he actually have the funds to continue? Or was he simply clueless about what was going on around him? Davis felt the pressure build. There was no way this man could keep bidding, could he? $1 million, Davis called out confidently, as if daring Samuel to match it. Who will give me $1 million for this incredible work of art? The room was waiting for the next person to bid, and Samuel, without a moment's hesitation, raised his paddle again. The number he gave was small, almost laughable in comparison to the escalating prices. It was nothing more than a whisper against a roar. The bidding had reached astronomical levels now, and no one in their right mind would think that a modest bid like Samuel's could stand a chance. Davis's lips curled into a grin, but this time it wasn't a friendly grin. It was the smile of someone who knew they had the upper hand. "A brave move, sir," he said with a mocking tone, his voice ringing out across the room. "But I'm afraid this is not a game for amateurs. It's for serious collectors." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I think we've all seen who the real players are, haven't we?" The crowd chuckled again, and Samuel, unfazed, lowered his paddle slowly, returning to his seat. The silence that followed was brief, but it was enough for everyone to realize that the game had already shifted in Davis's mind. He had dismissed Samuel, and in doing so had placed himself firmly at the center of the action. The old man, whoever he was, didn't belong here, and the crowd knew it. But even as Davis allowed himself a moment of victory, he felt a twinge of discomfort. The old man hadn't reacted as expected. He hadn't shown any signs of frustration or embarrassment. In fact, Samuel's silence made Davis uneasy, almost as if he had done something wrong. The auctioneer quickly shook off the thought, forcing himself to refocus on the crowd, moving on to the next round of bidding. The price climbed higher, and Samuel remained still in the background, his eyes fixed on the painting, but his mind working, plotting, calculating. Davis, meanwhile, was oblivious to the quiet storm gathering in the corner of the room. He had no idea that Samuel's presence was far from random, that this auction wasn't just a game to Samuel, it was personal. The painting's price surged higher and higher, a $1 million figure hanging in the air like a shimmering mirage. The room buzzed with excitement, the wealthy bidders growing more anxious as the stakes increased. Samuel remained an enigma in the back, an outsider who seemed to be nothing more than a distraction for the other players. They whispered, they snickered, but Samuel didn't even flinch. It was as though his presence didn't even affect him. He hadn't bid again, and the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Davis, for his part, felt an odd sense of satisfaction. The old man had been put in his place, humiliated in front of the crowd. Davis had expertly deflected the challenge, proving that the world of high-stakes art wasn't for people like Samuel. The auctioneer's confidence returned, his voice growing more animated as he called for higher bids, pushing the crowd to keep going. But in the back of the room, Samuel's eyes never left the painting. His gaze was intense, studying it in a way that made it clear he knew it intimately, not just as a piece of art, but as a chapter in his own life. The crowd around him had no idea what he was thinking, and Davis was more than happy to let them remain in the dark. As the price crossed the $2 million mark, one of the wealthier bidders, a tall man with a smug expression and a well-tailored suit, raised his paddle eagerly. The others followed suit, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the bidding war was about to settle into a predictable rhythm. But then, just as Davis began to announce the next bid, Samuel's hand shot up once again. The room froze. Davis's confident grin faltered as his eyes locked onto the old man. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Samuel's bid wasn't significant in terms of numbers, but the way he raised his paddle, a quiet, deliberate motion, set the room on edge. It wasn't just a bid, it was a statement. The crowd turned to him, their expressions shifting from confusion to something else. Curiosity, suspicion, perhaps even a hint of fear. $2,500,000, Samuel called out, his voice steady, calm, but cutting through the tension like a knife. The room stilled again. The wealthy bidders exchanged uneasy glances, the auctioneer's smooth facade slipping for just a moment. He quickly recovered, though, plastering on a forced smile as he addressed the room. "Ah, yes, a bid from, Mr. Samuel, I see." Davis's voice trembled slightly, betraying his discomfort. "A brave bid indeed, but I'm afraid it's a bit beyond your reach. Let's see who can take it higher, shall we?" The crowd laughed nervously, but there was a flicker of doubt in the air. They had all seen what had just happened. Samuel, despite his unassuming appearance, had made a move that suggested he was no amateur. His calm demeanor, his quiet confidence. It was as if he belonged here, even if the rest of the room couldn't quite understand why. The tall man who had been leading the bidding hesitated, looking at his competitors. His paddle remained lowered, but there was a shift in his demeanor. Davis, sensing an opportunity to regain control, continued to drive the bids higher. 3 million, he called out, his voice once again booming with authority. 3 million for this masterpiece. Surely someone can go higher than that. Samuel didn't respond immediately, but his eyes were fixed on the painting with a focused intensity. His gaze softened, as if lost in a memory only he could understand. The room, once filled with laughter and mockery, had turned into a battleground. There was a palpable shift, an undercurrent of unease running through the air. The bid was now beyond reach for most people in the room. Samuel, however, wasn't fazed. With a steady hand, he raised his paddle again, this time without hesitation. 5 million, he declared quietly, yet his words cut through the tension like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the room. 5 million. Who was this man, really? The wealthiest collectors in the room had been jockeying for position, each hoping to claim the painting as their own. But no one had dared to go that far. 5 million was a game-changer, a sum that few could afford, especially with the kind of casual ease that Samuel had shown. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Time, the bidding war, even the crowd's whispers. Davis's expression turned from confusion to disbelief. His mouth opened, but the words stuck in his throat. He had seen many wealthy bidders in his time, people who played the game and knew how to win. But this man, this unassuming old man, had just thrown down a bid that seemed both absurd and inevitable. Davis didn't know what to do. This wasn't supposed to happen. The crowd's laughter had died down, replaced by nervous glances and hushed murmurs. Samuel had just changed the entire dynamic. The wealthy man who had been leading the charge hesitated, his eyes flickering from Samuel to the auctioneer. There was a brief moment of uncertainty, a moment where it seemed like the entire room was waiting for someone to step in and take control. But Samuel, ever the silent player, made no further move. He simply waited. His calm presence radiated something deeper, something that couldn't be easily ignored. Davis cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of authority. 5 million, he said again, louder this time, but his voice cracked. 5 million, going once, going twice. He paused, the silence hanging thick in the air. The room was holding its breath. The tension in the room was now unbearable. Every eye was fixed on Samuel, watching his every move. The crowd had gone from bemusement to a sort of anxious respect, unsure how to read him, unsure of what was going to happen next. 5 million. It was a figure that should have been met with outrage or disbelief, but instead, it seemed almost natural coming from him. There was something about the way he sat there, hands folded in his lap, unshaken by the whirlwind of bids and the laughter that had once been aimed at him. He was no longer the outsider. He was the one in control. Davis, meanwhile, stood at the podium, caught between disbelief and frustration. His confidence had cracked, the cracks widening with each passing second. The auctioneer's hands gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white, his eyes flicking nervously from Samuel to the crowd, hoping someone would step in. He couldn't just let it end like this. He couldn't let this old man, this nobody, have the upper hand. Not after everything. Going once, Davis repeated, his voice a little shakier now. Going twice. He hesitated, his mind racing, trying to find a way to salvage the situation. The room waited for his final call, but something in Samuel's expression stopped him. The old man's eyes were steady, unwavering, a calm certainty radiating from him. It was as though he had already won. 5 million and sold, Davis finally muttered, his voice faltering as he struck the gavel down. The finality of the moment rang out through the room, echoing off the marble floors. But Davis wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even sure what had just happened. His mind was still catching up to the events unfolding before him. There was a moment of stunned silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, slowly, the murmur of the crowd began to swell, rising in disbelief. 5 million. The old man had done it. He had bought it. And with no fanfare, no dramatic bidding war, just a quiet, assured decision, he had claimed the painting as his own. Samuel stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as though he were savoring the moment. He walked to the front, his shoes clicking softly on the floor, the room parting for him like the sea. There was no rush, no need for haste. His composure was a stark contrast to the tense energy in the room. He had done it. He had taken control without anyone even realizing it. Davis stood frozen, his gavel still in hand, staring at the man who had just walked away with the most expensive item in the auction, leaving the rest of the room to stew in their confusion. Samuel reached the podium, his eyes never leaving Davis's. The auctioneer's face was a mixture of disbelief and shame, but Samuel didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His very presence in that moment said everything. The old man had outwitted him. He had outplayed him in the one game Davis thought he had mastered. "I'll be paying in cash," Samuel said, his voice soft but carrying through the now silent room. The words were simple, but they had the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths behind them. Cash, no negotiations, no credit, just the cold, hard reality of his power. As if to emphasize the point, Samuel reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of bills, thick enough to make the room collectively gasp. The paper was crisp, the stacks perfectly aligned. He laid it out on the table before the auctioneer, each bill a symbol of the final blow to Davis's pride. The room was paralyzed. The wealthy patrons who had once mocked Samuel were now speechless. There was no denying it. The man had just bought the painting with cash, with no strings attached. It was a blow to the ego of everyone in the room, especially Davis, who had based his whole identity on this high-stakes game of wealth and status. Davis stood there, his gavel still in his hand, unable to speak, his mind spinning. He looked from the cash to Samuel, from the old man's calm face to the painting now in his possession. The realization hit him hard. All of his assumptions, all of his judgments about Samuel, about who he was and what he could afford, had been wrong. And now, in front of the entire room, he was the one who looked foolish, the one who had underestimated the quiet man in the back of the room. "Are you sure?" Davis finally stammered, trying to regain some composure, but his words lacked conviction. "I mean, this is a lot of money." His voice was a fraction of what it had been, shrinking under the weight of Samuel's calm assurance. Samuel smiled, just a faint curve of his lips. "I'm sure," he said simply. The room was silent again. No one moved. No one dared to speak, as if waiting for the auctioneer to do something, anything, to salvage his dignity. But nothing could change what had just happened. Samuel had won, and the rest of them had been played. Davis stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. His pride was crushed, his smugness evaporated, and the reality of his mistake settled like a cold, heavy weight on his shoulders. He had laughed at Samuel, he had mocked him, underestimated him, and now, in front of everyone, he had been shown for what he really was. Just another man who believed money and status were the only things that mattered. Without another word, Samuel took the painting from the auctioneer's trembling hands, nodding once in acknowledgement, and began to walk away. The crowd parted to let him pass, but no one spoke. No one dared to break the silence. And as Samuel made his way to the exit, the auctioneer was left standing at the podium, a public symbol of his own shame. It was no longer a room full of wealthy collectors. It was a room full of people who had just learned a very important lesson. Appearances can be deceiving. The room was heavy with a silence that felt oppressive, like a storm cloud hanging over everyone. No one dared to speak as Samuel moved steadily toward the exit, the painting under his arm like a quiet victory, a symbol of something much greater than just a high-priced acquisition. His calm demeanor, unshaken by the events that had just unfolded, seemed to send ripples of discomfort through the crowd. The wealthy patrons, who had once whispered and laughed at his presence, now looked at him with something resembling awe, mixed with a deep sense of regret. Davis, still standing frozen behind the podium, felt as though the floor had dropped out beneath him. He hadn't even noticed when the cash had been placed in front of him. All he could focus on now was the fact that in front of the entire room, he had been humiliated, reduced to nothing more than a figurehead in a game he thought he knew so well. His gavel was still clutched tightly in his hand, as if it might somehow restore his control, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Samuel had claimed the spotlight, and now, the auctioneer stood at the center of it all, surrounded by a circle of uncertainty and quiet shame. The other bidders, once so sure of themselves, exchanged uneasy glances. They had all been part of the spectacle, feeding into Davis's arrogance, but none of them had expected this twist. It was almost too surreal to process. The man they had all dismissed, mocked even, had just walked away with the most prized item of the night, and they had let him do it. The realization gnawed at them, creeping up like an uncomfortable truth. Samuel had become the center of their world, and they had become spectators in his. As Samuel reached the door, he paused, just for a moment, as though reflecting on the absurdity of it all. The weight of the painting was nothing compared to the weight of the lesson he had just imparted, not just to the auctioneer, but to the crowd as well. They had learned that day that wealth and status were not the final measure of a person's worth. There was something deeper, something more potent than money and appearance, something that could not be so easily measured or underestimated. Without turning back, Samuel pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool night air, the chaos of the auction house fading behind him like a distant memory. For a brief moment, it felt as if the world had paused, leaving him alone with the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had played the game on his terms, and won. Inside, the room began to stir, but it wasn't the same buzz of excitement that had filled it before. There was no more laughter, no more easy conversations. Instead, people were quietly talking to each other, their voices low, as if they were afraid to speak too loudly for fear of drawing attention to their own folly. Even Davis seemed to shrink behind the podium, his chest heaving slightly as he tried to regain some semblance of composure. He had thought he understood the rules. He had thought he was the one with the power. But now, as the crowd's whispers grew louder, he realized just how wrong he had been. The old man, the one they had all dismissed, had seen through the facade. He had played them all, and now Davis stood alone, a symbol of his own arrogance and the harsh reality of the world he had thought he controlled. As Samuel's car pulled away from the auction house, the city lights blurred in the distance, the painting now safely tucked away in the back seat. He didn't look back. There was no need to. The lesson had been delivered, and he had no intention of revisiting it. For him, this wasn't about the painting. It wasn't about the money. It was about something much more personal, a moment of quiet justice, a reminder to everyone who had ever looked down on him that they too could be humbled. Back at the auction house, as the evening wore on, the crowd slowly began to dissipate. The guests filed out, each one carrying their own thoughts, their own realizations. The night had ended, but the ripples of Samuel's victory would remain long after the doors were closed. No one would ever forget what had happened that evening, not just the painting, but the man who had taught them all a lesson in humility. And for Samuel, there was a quiet sense of satisfaction. The world, for all its pretensions, had been reminded that there was more to a person than what they could see on the surface. The old man had shown them that power wasn't always loud, wasn't always flashy. Sometimes it was the quiet ones, the ones who knew how to wait, how to observe, who held the real strength. As the car drove further away, Samuel allowed himself a small, knowing smile. He had made his point, and the world had heard it loud and clear. The following day, the story of the auction spread like wildfire. By morning, social media was buzzing with posts about the old man who had bought the $1 million painting in cash, and whispers about who he really was were circulating fast. News outlets picked up the story, turning Samuel into an overnight sensation. Some called him a mysterious millionaire, while others speculated about his true identity. Was he a retired art collector, a secret billionaire, or was he someone entirely different, someone who had lived his life outside the public eye? only to emerge at the right moment with a quiet but undeniable power. In the offices of the auction house, Davis sat behind his desk, his face buried in his hands. The articles, the headlines, the videos, all of it felt like an avalanche crashing down on him. He hadn't been able to sleep the entire night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Samuel walking away with the painting, his composed figure a stark contrast to the chaos around him. The humiliation stung, even more so because he hadn't seen it coming. His colleagues had tried to reassure him, telling him that it was just a one-off. Every auction has its oddities, they said. This will blow over. But Davis knew better. This wasn't something that could simply be swept under the rug. The story had legs. It was the kind of story that lingered, one that people would remember. And worse still, it wasn't just the public that was talking. The higher-ups at the auction house were furious. They'd been getting calls all morning from collectors and clients who wanted explanations. How had this happened? How had they let someone like Samuel walk away with such an important piece? The more Davis tried to explain, the worse it sounded. His reputation, once polished and sharp, was now tarnished, and he had no idea how to salvage it. Meanwhile, in a small, quiet corner of the city, Samuel was doing what he always did, living his life as he had for years. His home, far from being a mansion or an extravagant estate, was modest and simple. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with old novels, history books, and a few carefully curated pieces of art. There were no flashy displays of wealth, no gold trim or opulence. It was a place of quiet comfort, where Samuel could sit and reflect without the noise of the world intruding. He sat at a small wooden table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his gaze wandering over the painting that now hung on the wall. It wasn't just a masterpiece. It was a piece of history, something that had meant something to him long before it became a sought-after commodity. He didn't need the world to understand why he had purchased it. He had his reasons, and that was enough. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Samuel picked it up without hesitation, recognizing the number immediately. "Samuel," a voice on the other end said. It was an unfamiliar voice, sharp and to the point. "This is Gregory White from White & Company. We'd like to discuss something with you about the recent purchase you made." Samuel sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Gregory White. He had heard the name before, one of the wealthiest art dealers in the city. He had a reputation for playing the game at the highest level, and it wasn't often that he reached out to someone like Samuel. "I'm listening," Samuel said quietly, his tone neutral. "We've been following your recent acquisition," Gregory continued, his voice smooth but with an edge of curiosity. "And, well, let's just say we're interested in discussing a few matters. You've obviously made quite an impression, and we think it's worth talking about." Samuel paused, weighing the words carefully. He wasn't interested in playing the games Gregory and his kind thrived on, but there was something about the way the dealer spoke, something that made Samuel curious about the underlying motives. "I'm not looking to sell," Samuel replied, his voice firm. "I'm not interested in any deals or negotiations." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," Gregory said finally, though there was a trace of disappointment in his voice. "But perhaps there's something else we can discuss. Let's just say, we've been very intrigued by your background. There are people who would like to meet you, Samuel. People who could make things very interesting for someone like you." Samuel's fingers tightened around his cup, but his expression remained unchanged. He had heard these kinds of offers before. Hidden behind layers of politeness and smooth words were always the same intentions: control, influence, and power. "I don't need anyone to make things interesting for me," Samuel replied, his voice cool and steady. "I have everything I need." The line was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel could almost hear Gregory's frustration growing on the other side. Finally, Gregory spoke again, his tone softened, but still holding a hint of steel. "Well, if you change your mind, Samuel, you know where to find us. But be careful, my friend. There are some who won't be as understanding as we are." Samuel hung up the phone, his eyes never leaving the painting on the wall. He had known the call was coming. He had known that, after his unexpected victory, the world would take notice. But he wasn't interested in their games. His motives, his intentions, had nothing to do with money or power. He didn't need their approval, and he didn't need their offers. The world had learned its lesson the night before. The game of appearances, of status and wealth, was not one he was willing to play by their rules. He was the one who had controlled the narrative, who had shifted the course of the evening without ever raising his voice or his paddle more than once. That was power. True power. And it didn't come from buying art or living in mansions. It came from understanding the world and the people in it better than they understood themselves. And Samuel understood that in a way that none of them ever would. As the days passed, the fallout from the auction continued to ripple through the art world. Davis, once the proud face of the prestigious auction house, had been quietly removed from his position. His reputation was tarnished beyond repair, and the higher-ups at the auction house seemed to be distancing themselves from the entire fiasco. The press coverage, too, had taken a turn. What was once a brief story of an eccentric bidder had evolved into a cautionary tale. Articles about the auction's chaos ran daily, with headlines like, "Old Man Outsmarts Millionaire Bidders" and "The Auctioneer Who Underestimated the Power of Silence." It was a public embarrassment that no one could escape. In contrast, Samuel remained a ghost in the machine. No one knew exactly who he was or why he had acted the way he did. His silence, his measured actions, had kept him shrouded in mystery. But there was something undeniably magnetic about him now. People were curious. And curiosity, as they say, has a way of growing legs. He hadn't made any public statements, nor had he appeared in any interviews. His name was now synonymous with quiet power, a figure who had slipped unnoticed through the cracks of society, only to reveal a hidden strength when the moment called for it. And despite the rumors swirling about his wealth and background, Samuel never let any of it sway him. He knew better than to let the noise affect him. The call from Gregory White was just the beginning. Samuel knew that more people would reach out, more would try to figure out what he wanted, what he was after. He had lived a long time learning how to control the narrative, how to keep people guessing. He had learned the hard way that those who didn't speak often held the most power. The world had underestimated him, but he had never underestimated the world. It wasn't long before another call came, this one from a more familiar voice. "Samuel," the voice on the other end of the line said, its tone cautious but respectful. It was Michael Turner, an old acquaintance from Samuel's past. Michael had been in the world of art for decades, an advisor to collectors and a trusted name in the industry. Samuel had known him long before the auction, but their paths had diverged over the years. Still, Michael had always respected Samuel's knowledge and his quiet, calculated approach to life. "I saw the auction," Michael continued, his voice tinged with admiration. "Quite the display, my friend. Quite the display indeed." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He had known this call would come as well. People like Michael had been watching, waiting for a moment like this to emerge. They didn't reach out to him out of curiosity or admiration. They reached out because they saw an opportunity. Samuel had no interest in their schemes. "I'm not interested in the spotlight," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to make headlines." "I know that," Michael said quickly, almost apologetically. "But I think there's something more here than you realize. I think there's an opportunity, Samuel. Something that could really change things for both of us." Samuel's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest of his chair. He had heard this kind of talk before. Opportunity. Change. What people like Michael really meant was power. Leverage. It was the same pitch wrapped in different words. "I'm not interested in power," Samuel replied evenly, his voice carrying a quiet finality. "And I'm not interested in anything you're offering. I've spent my life learning to do things on my own terms. I don't need anyone to tell me how to play the game." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Michael seemed to be considering his next words carefully, knowing that Samuel was a man who did not easily bend. "I respect that," Michael said at last, his tone shifting to one of understanding. But the world is changing, Samuel. The game is different now. People like us don't get to stay hidden forever. Eventually, someone will come looking for you, and when they do, you'll have to decide whether you want to play or not." Samuel paused, feeling the weight of the words. He knew that Michael wasn't wrong. The world had already begun to shift. The moment at the auction had marked the beginning of something else, something far bigger than just a painting or a bid. It had awakened a hunger in people, curiosity, fascination, and perhaps even fear. They wanted to know who he was, what he could do, and how far his reach really extended. "I've already played my part," Samuel said softly, his gaze once again falling on the painting on the wall. "And I'm done with the game." He hung up the phone without waiting for a response, the decision final. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His message had been sent, and it had been received loud and clear. The world had witnessed the quiet power he wielded that night, and now it was theirs to reckon with. But Samuel didn't care about the fame or the power that might come his way. What mattered to him was that, for once, the world had seen things from his perspective. The game had been played on his terms, and it was over. As he sat back in his chair looking out the window, Samuel knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is the one you never say aloud. The silence spoke for itself, and in that silence Samuel had already won. The days after the auction felt like an odd kind of stillness for Samuel. Despite the continued chatter in the press and the swirling rumors about him, he had returned to the rhythms of his daily life as though nothing had changed. The quiet, unassuming routine of his existence was his refuge. He spent his mornings reading, his afternoons strolling through the local parks, and his evenings alone with the soft hum of his thoughts. There was something comforting about the mundane, something grounding about the simplicity of it all. Samuel knew that the world around him was chaotic, but it had never been his world. He had always existed on the fringes, watching, learning, never fully engaging. But the calls kept coming. The world wasn't finished with him yet. Every time the phone rang, it was a reminder that his quiet victory had made waves he could not ignore. The people who had once dismissed him were now the ones reaching out, curious, intrigued, eager to understand the enigma that he had become. And with each call, each letter, each inquiry, Samuel knew that his quiet control over the narrative had only made him more powerful. But he didn't want that. He never had. Still, there was something undeniable in the weight of it all. As much as he wished to remain an anonymous figure, he couldn't escape the fact that in one moment, he had shifted the power dynamic. He had been underestimated, laughed at, dismissed. Yet in a single bid, he had forced the world to see him. The world's obsession with wealth and status had been turned on its head. He had done it without force, without aggression, only with the calm assurance that comes from knowing one's worth. And now more people were looking at him, waiting for his next move. It wasn't long before Samuel found himself face to face with the man who had been at the heart of his most recent victory, Davis, the former auctioneer. It had been an unexpected encounter, one that Samuel had not sought out. He had been walking down the street lost in his thoughts when he saw the familiar face from the auction approaching. Davis, looking even more disheveled than before, his once polished suit now wrinkled and worn, seemed to carry the weight of the past few days like a physical burden. Davis stopped when he saw Samuel, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and something else. Perhaps shame, perhaps a touch of bitterness. "Samuel," he said, his voice low, tentative, as though he wasn't sure if he should even be speaking to him. Samuel didn't respond immediately. He studied Davis for a moment, observing the man who had once been so full of confidence, so sure of his place in the world. Now he was broken, defeated, a shadow of the figure who had mocked Samuel at the auction. "Davis," Samuel finally said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I didn't expect to see you." I didn't expect to see you either," Davis stammered, clearly unsettled by the encounter. "Listen, I just wanted to apologize for how I treated you. It wasn't right. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just someone who didn't belong, and I treated you like that. I'm sorry." Samuel looked at him for a long time, letting the words hang in the air between them. He had seen Davis's type before, the type who believed that power was a matter of who you knew, how you dressed, and what you could buy. They thought they controlled the world by their influence, but when they were stripped of that, they were left with nothing. "There's no need for apologies," Samuel said softly, almost as if he were speaking to a child. "What happened at the auction was the result of your own actions. You assumed I was someone you could dismiss, and now you've learned a valuable lesson." Davis's eyes flickered with embarrassment, but there was a deeper pain there too. His shoulders sagged, and he lowered his head slightly, as though ashamed to face the consequences of his actions. "I've lost everything, Samuel," Davis admitted, his voice breaking. "The auction house let me go. They think I'm a joke, all because of you." Samuel didn't take pleasure in Davis's misery. In fact, he felt a strange sense of pity for the man. The world had a way of punishing arrogance, of taking those who thought they were untouchable and bringing them low. But it wasn't Samuel's doing. He had simply played his hand in the way that was best for him, and the world had reacted accordingly. "I didn't take anything from you," Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm. "You gave it to yourself when you chose to mock me, when you thought that power and money were the only things that mattered." Davis nodded slowly, the weight of the truth settling on him. He understood now what Samuel had been trying to tell him all along. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be bought, something that couldn't be faked. There was a long pause before Davis spoke again. Do you think I can rebuild? Can I start over?" Samuel's gaze softened, and for the first time, he saw the man before him not as an adversary, but as someone who was simply lost, trying to find his way back. "It's possible," Samuel said quietly, "but it will take more than money. It will take something you've lost. Humility. You'll have to earn the trust of those around you again. It won't be easy." Davis nodded again, this time more resolutely. He looked up at Samuel, his expression one of quiet understanding. The man who had once thought himself invincible now stood before him, humbled by the same forces that had brought him to this point. "I'll try," Davis said, his voice steady for the first time in days. "I'll try." With that, the two men stood there for a moment longer, the weight of their encounter hanging in the air. Then, without another word, Samuel turned and began to walk away, leaving Davis to contemplate the lesson he had learned. Samuel knew that this wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. The world had seen the quiet strength of one man, and for the first time in a long time, it had been forced to reconsider what true power really looked like. As he walked down the street, Samuel couldn't help but feel that, in his own small way, he had changed the game forever. The days after his encounter with Davis were quiet. Samuel didn't feel the need to acknowledge the shifts taking place around him. The world continued to whisper about him, continued to search for any clue that might explain who he was or why he had acted the way he did. But Samuel had long ago learned that silence often spoke louder than words. The more they searched for answers, the less they would find, and that, in itself, was his power. As he walked through the city on a brisk autumn afternoon, Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The world was still turning, still buzzing with its usual noise, but he had stepped outside of it. His victory was not one of grand gestures, of announcements or interviews. It was a quiet victory, the kind that didn't need to be flaunted. He had made his point, and he had done so with the quiet dignity that had always defined him. The rest of the world could catch up when it was ready. But as much as he longed for the peace of his solitude, there were moments when he felt the pull of the world once again. The calls, the offers, the rumors, they hadn't stopped. People who once saw him as nothing more than an inconsequential figure now wanted to know what he could do, what he was capable of. They were trying to figure out his next move, but Samuel had already decided it. He wasn't interested in playing their games. He wasn't interested in being a part of their world. His place was on the fringes, where he could see everything without being consumed by it. One morning, as he sat in his favorite cafe, sipping on a cup of black coffee, Samuel caught a glimpse of something unexpected. A figure walked into the cafe, tall, dressed in a dark coat, with an air of confidence that was immediately recognizable. It was Gregory White, the art dealer who had reached out to him earlier. Gregory's eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Samuel, they softened for just a moment, like he had expected to find him there. Without missing a beat, Gregory approached Samuel's table, pulling out the chair across from him. Samuel didn't react, his gaze still steady, still calm. He had been expecting this too. People like Gregory were always persistent, always hungry for control. "I see you've been keeping to yourself," Gregory said, settling into the chair. His voice was smooth, but there was a faint edge to it, a sense that he was trying to gauge Samuel's mood. "I won't waste your time with pleasantries. I think we both know why I'm here." Samuel took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth of the liquid settle in his chest. Gregory's words were predictable, but his approach was different now. Respectful, even cautious. He had come not to offer a deal, but to acknowledge something. Samuel didn't need to ask what it was. "You want to know why I did it?" Samuel said simply, his voice measured. Gregory leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Samuel's. "Not exactly. I already know the answer. It's not about the painting. It's never been about the painting." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You've shown us something, Samuel. Something we all thought we understood, but clearly we didn't. It's not just about wealth or status or appearances. It's about control. It's about knowing how to move in a world that's constantly shifting." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He had already heard this before, in different forms, from different people. Everyone thought they understood the game, but very few truly did. They all believed it was about the money, about who could buy the most, who could claim the most prestigious prizes. But Samuel had never cared about any of that. His power lay not in what he could acquire, but in what he could make others believe. He controlled the narrative simply by remaining a mystery. "I don't play the game the way you do," Samuel said, his voice steady. "You believe power comes from what you can see, what you can touch. But true power comes from what isn't seen, from what isn't immediately obvious." Gregory studied him for a moment, clearly trying to understand. "And that's what you want, isn't it? To remain unseen, to stay on the outside, where no one can touch you. But Samuel, you can't stay hidden forever. People like you, with your influence, they always get pulled in eventually. You'll have to make a choice." Samuel didn't flinch. He knew exactly what Gregory was implying. It was the same offer they always made. The temptation to step into the light, to take a seat at the table, to play by their rules. But Samuel had never been interested in their rules. He didn't need to play their game, and he didn't need to be part of their world. His power came from his ability to remain untouched by it. "I don't need to be a part of your world," Samuel said simply. "I've already built my own, and I've learned that sometimes the best way to win is to simply walk away." Gregory paused, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to respect. "You're saying no to everything," he murmured, almost to himself. "No to fame, no to fortune, no to the power you could wield." Samuel nodded slowly, the silence between them growing. "I'm not saying no to anything. I'm just saying no to the illusion of control. I've never needed anyone's approval, Gregory. And that, I believe, is the most powerful thing a person can have." For a long moment, Gregory said nothing. Then, with a slight nod, he stood up, as if he had come to terms with something that had been gnawing at him. "I see," he said quietly. "I understand now. But remember, Samuel, you can't remain an enigma forever." Samuel simply smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps, but for now that's enough." Gregory left without another word, his footsteps echoing softly in the cafe. And as Samuel sat back, watching the world move around him, He felt the familiar comfort of knowing that he had made the right choice. The world would always try to pull him in, always try to make him conform. But Samuel knew better. His power came from his ability to remain untouched by it all, and that, in the end, was the most powerful statement he could make. The weeks passed, and the world seemed to grow quieter, as if it had finally come to terms with Samuel's silence. The constant calls and offers tapered off, the headlines gradually losing their luster. People were beginning to move on, their curiosity sated but unanswered, as Samuel had no interest in explaining himself or stepping into the limelight. He had made his point. The world had learned that appearances were deceiving, that power wasn't always tied to wealth, and that sometimes the quietest voices held the greatest strength. Still, life went on. The rhythms of the city continued unchanged, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of daily life. It all carried on without a pause, as if the entire episode with the auction house had never happened. And Samuel, as ever, remained on the periphery. He went about his days with the same routine: morning walks, evenings spent reading, and the occasional trip to the local cafe. He didn't need the world to know his name, to understand who he was, or to seek his approval. His quiet, steadfast control was enough. But one evening, as the golden glow of the sunset bathed the city in warmth, Samuel found himself at the park, watching the world from his usual spot on a worn wooden bench. The park had always been his place of solace, a refuge from the chaos of the world. It was here that he had first begun to understand the value of silence, the power of watching and waiting. In the stillness there was clarity. In the distance, children played on the swings, couples walked hand in hand, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the air. It was a simple, peaceful scene, but it was one Samuel had come to cherish. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he noticed a familiar figure approaching from the path. It was Michael Turner, the art advisor who had reached out to him months ago, the one who had tried to offer him a place in the game. Michael was alone, his steps slow, his face thoughtful. Samuel watched him approach, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. Michael knew what Samuel was capable of, what he had shown to the world. He had seen firsthand that Samuel's power didn't come from playing the game. It came from not playing it at all. "Mind if I sit?" Michael asked finally, his voice respectful, no longer the eager tone of someone looking for a deal. Samuel nodded, gesturing to the empty space on the bench. Michael sat down beside him, both of them gazing out at the park as if there were no rush, no agenda. "I've been thinking about what you said," Michael began after a long silence, "about power, about control." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You were right. I've spent my entire career thinking that it's all about what you can buy, who you know, and what you can put your name on. But what you showed me, what you showed everyone, was that real power has nothing to do with any of that. It's about understanding the game, without ever having to play it. It's about knowing that you don't need anyone's approval to be someone important." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He wasn't interested in flattery or empty praise. But Michael's words weren't just idle compliments. There was genuine understanding in them, a quiet acknowledgement that Samuel had shifted something fundamental in his thinking. "I've spent a lot of time since then trying to understand what you did," Michael continued, his voice softer now. "And I'll be honest, I don't know if I could ever do it myself, but I respect it, more than I respect anything I've done in my own career." Samuel glanced over at Michael, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a man who sought validation, but it seemed as though Michael had finally understood the lesson Samuel had been trying to teach all along. It wasn't about winning a bid or acquiring the rarest art. It was about walking away from it all and still knowing you held the most valuable thing in the room, your sense of self. "I'm not looking for respect, Michael," Samuel said quietly, his tone grounded, unwavering. "What I did wasn't for anyone else, it was for me. It was about showing that there's more to this world than the things people covet, and there's more to a person than their status, their wealth, or the things they collect." Michael nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. I get it now. I really do. Samuel turned his gaze back to the park, his mind drifting. There was peace in knowing that people like Michael could learn, that even in a world obsessed with wealth and appearance, there were still those who could see beyond it. Still, Samuel didn't feel the need to push any further. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to others to decide whether they wanted to follow. The air was cool as evening descended on the park, the last traces of sunlight fading into the horizon. Samuel and Michael sat in quiet companionship, two men who had once been part of very different worlds, now brought together by an understanding that transcended those boundaries. Michael had learned something that Samuel had known all along, that true power didn't come from the things you owned or the people you knew. It came from the quiet assurance that you didn't need to own anything or know anyone to be significant. Samuel stood up slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him. He didn't need to explain himself any further. He had already made his point. And in the stillness of the evening, he knew that the game, for him, was over. He had won without ever trying. With a final glance at Michael, who was still sitting in contemplation, Samuel walked away, disappearing into the gathering shadows of the park. Samuel's footsteps echoed softly against the pavement as he made his way through the park. The evening had deepened, and the air had turned crisp, but it didn't matter. There was a certain peace in the stillness of the night that had become familiar to him. He had made his point. The world had been forced to see things from his perspective, and now it was up to them to decide what to do with that knowledge. The path ahead was clear, but Samuel didn't hurry. He knew that his quiet victory wasn't about headlines or recognition. It wasn't even about the painting he had purchased. It was about the lessons he had imparted without speaking a word, about the power of staying silent when the world was desperate to hear something, anything. He had shown them that power wasn't always about loud gestures or flashy displays. Sometimes the most profound strength lay in restraint, in the ability to step back and observe. His mind wandered back to the auction house, to the moment when the room had fallen silent after his bid. He had sensed it then, the shift, the realization that had come too late for the auctioneer and for everyone else. It wasn't just the money or the item. It was the idea that perhaps not everything could be bought or controlled. It was the idea that there were forces beyond their understanding, beyond their ability to manipulate. For a moment, Samuel allowed himself to smile, a rare flicker of contentment. He had never sought fame, and yet he had achieved something greater: respect. True, lasting respect. The kind that came not from appearances but from understanding, from the quiet recognition that someone had seen the world in a way that no one else had, and had done so without ever raising their voice. As he walked further into the darkening streets, Samuel felt the weight of the city around him, yet he didn't feel its pressure. He was no longer a part of its noise, its constant hustle. He had stepped outside of it, and in doing so, he had carved out a space for himself that was entirely his. No one could take that from him. He had lived his life with purpose, and now he would continue to live it on his own terms. He paused at the corner of the street, taking one last look at the city before stepping into the quiet of the night. There were no calls, no offers, no expectations, just the steady rhythm of his own thoughts. And in that moment, Samuel knew that his silence, his absence from the game, was not just a statement. It was his final victory. Weeks turned into months, and the world moved on, as it always did. The story of the auction and the mysterious old man faded into the background, replaced by new headlines, new stories, new dramas. The painting that Samuel had bought remained on the wall of his modest home, a symbol of something far greater than its price tag or the notoriety it had briefly brought. To others, it was just another valuable piece of art. But to Samuel, it was a reminder of his quiet victory, of the lessons he had taught, and of the power he had found in stepping back when everyone else rushed forward. In the days that followed, people continued to speculate about Samuel, though they no longer looked at him with the same condescending gaze they once had. The wealthy elite, the art world, and the movers and shakers who had once dismissed him now regarded him with a certain wariness. a silent acknowledgement that perhaps they had misunderstood him all along. He had become a legend, a figure whose true strength remained elusive and whose presence lingered long after he had disappeared from their sight. But Samuel wasn't interested in being a legend. He wasn't interested in being remembered. What mattered to him was that, for once, the world had been forced to confront its own assumptions. The auction house, Davis, the bidders, and the press, they had all been reminded that the things they valued most could be taken away in a single moment of quiet defiance. They had learned that the game could be played without ever having to show up. As for Samuel, he continued his life as he always had, on the periphery, observing, living simply. The phone never rang with offers anymore. The rumors died down, leaving him to his thoughts. He had no need for accolades, no desire for fame. He was content with his life, content with the choices he had made. And as he walked through the park on another cool evening, Samuel realized that he had found something that many spent their lives searching for but never found: peace. True peace, not in possessions or status, but in knowing that he had already won. He had played the game his way, and in the end, that was enough. The city continued to hum with its endless noise, its relentless pace. But Samuel, the old man who had once been laughed at, had stepped outside of it all. And in doing so, he had discovered the most profound victory of all: the ability to walk away, to live on his own terms, and to know that sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else. In the end, Samuel's story is one of quiet strength and resilience. He showed us that true power isn't about wealth or status, but about the courage to stand apart from the noise and live on your own terms. The world may try to define us by what we own or who we know, but Samuel reminds us that our true worth is in our character, in the way we choose to navigate life with dignity and humility. Sometimes the most profound victories come not from the battles we fight, but from the silence we embrace. If you were moved by Samuel's journey, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story impacted you.